Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Spring 2022 Urban Planning Symposium. Our primary topic today is racial equity in transportation, and we have a great group of speakers and panelists with experience in the field to share their work, thoughts, and perspectives. First off, I want to thank our sponsors for support. For their support in organizing the event. The Moneta Transportation Institute, MTI, the American Planning Association of the Northern California chapter, and also our student group sponsors, the Urban Planning Coalition and Transition at SJSU. Here's an overview of our agenda for the day. I'm going to be doing, my name is Trevor. I'm the president of the Urban Planning Coalition group, UPC. We were one of the sponsors of the event. And so I'm going to be doing welcome and introductions right now, and then we'll pass it off and we'll start it with the keynote, our keynote speaker, Tamika Butler, and we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll get started with the panel discussion and Q&A, and then we'll wrap up the event for the day. Let's get started with the first part of our event. Our keynote speaker, Tamika Butler, is a national expert and speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. And Tamika, I'll pass it over to you to talk more about what you do and give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Trevor. Super excited to be here. You guys have a great group of speakers lined up. I am gonna share my screen. Let's see.
Well, let me stop sharing, I think. Let me see. Okay, I stopped.
Okay. And then, are you seeing this in presentation mode?
Yep, I see it.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about abolition and transportation. I'll try to get through these slides pretty quickly so we can leave plenty of time for questions. And so just a little bit about who I am. My name is Tamika. I'm an urban planning PhD student in the UCLA Urban Planning Department with a focus on transportation. And then, you know, I also, in my background, have been a lawyer, have run a couple of urban planning related nonprofits, including the LA County Bicycle Coalition and the LA Neighborhood Land Trust, have served on the board of organizations like Transit Center and Affordable Housing Land Trust here in South Central. And in addition to consulting, I also run my own consulting business, TLB Consulting. And so with my, I see a raised hand. Should I stop?
I think we could do questions at the end, or whatever you would prefer, Tamika.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't somebody who needed something urgently. But I would say for folks, if you have questions throughout, put them in the Q&A. And that way, if it is something you need urgently, we can handle it in the moment. But if it's something that you just want to make sure you don't forget, then I will make sure to take a look and make sure we address it in the Q&A. Okay, great. So what do I do at my consulting firm? I kind of do a number of things. I work with government agencies and large nonprofits like NACDO. That kind of is an organization that any cities can join. I've worked with the LA County Sustainability Office and helped them with the sustainability plan. And then I led a team working with MetroLink here in LA, thinking about how they can think about fares and accessibility and affordability. I also do some freelance writing with Bicycling Magazine. I've done a lot of work with different tech companies and thinking about emerging mobility. I've done some work in San Jose with some folks who you'll hear from later. And then because my background is in nonprofits, I like to work with nonprofits as much as possible. I was really lucky to work with groups like Transform and Act LA and helping frame different reports. And then just like today, do some public speaking. And so when I think about abolition, and you know, we're in a moment where a lot of folks are talking about potentially defunding the police, and some people think that's controversial, but I like to just think about the way in which policing has been a critical part of transportation work, right? And so one of the first things I think of is Vision Zero. So when Vision Zero was first really popping off here in California, there was a great advocate in the Bay, Leah, who used to run the Bike Coalition and started a Vision Zero organization. And you know, I was a young planner at the time. I had just been hired at the LA County Bicycle Coalition. You know, I was really, really excited. And I had this amazing job, right? Working at the Bicycle Coalition, got to wear wrinkled clothes to work every day, ride my bike everywhere. I was part of a coalition of folks who were fighting for Vision Zero in Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, we felt particularly proud of our coalition because it wasn't just biking and walking folks. We were certainly there, but it was youth organizations, it was racial justice organizations, it was voters' rights organizations. It was, you know, all sorts of organizations that came together and said, we see Vision Zero as something that's really important. We got to, you know, take part in press conferences, and it was this really exciting time because Vision Zero was also happening when bike share was getting started in LA, when we were, you know, pursuing a sales tax measure that ended up passing and being, you know, our first sales tax that explicitly gave money to biking and walking. So life was good. I got to ride my bike to award shows, hang out with important folks. You know, no slaps at our award shows, just bad jokes and fancy clothes. And all of that was great. But I think for a lot of us folks of color in the transportation space, we still had some questions, right? We still wanted to know if Vision Zero could work. And part of why we wanted to know if Vision Zero could work is because we understood that our country had racism inherently built in. That is part of our legacy of urban planning, right? And Vision Zero is this policy we've imported from European countries that don't necessarily have the same history that we have. But whenever we wanted to talk about whether or not enforcement should be one of the E's, and how do you use enforcement to make people safer, if there are many of us for whom enforcement rings with fears of death, right? And what we often heard from other folks in the transportation space and the bike space is that they just weren't interested in hearing that. It was like they thought we didn't care about transportation or we didn't care about safety because we wanted to talk about other aspects of safety, right? And I would wish that lessons were learned during that process. But then in the summer of 2020, we saw a lot of this happening again, right? So one of the things I like about being an urban planner, right? I've left my old career of law behind. I'm pursuing a PhD, like I'm all in now, right? And one of the things I like about being an urban planner is that I think most folks who get into planning and transportation planning, you know, is my specialty, but I think most of us are just good people. Like when we think about why we do the work we do, it's because we want to connect people and places and things, and we want to help. And so a lot of times it feels like when you're in planning spaces, when we get back to doing more of these symposiums and conferences in person, when we're in spaces with other folks who care about planning, it feels like we're all on the same page. It feels like, oh my gosh, I'm with my people. But all of a sudden during the pandemic, it was almost like when Vision Zero was really popping again. And it started to feel like, are we all on the same page? And some of us were looking at folks like Fauci looking at Trump, right? And this was a common sentiment that was expressed during the pandemic. And I would say we're still during the pandemic, but many people want us to be post-pandemic. But when the pandemic was in the heat, a lot of people were saying, you know, our country is suffering from these two major crises, racism and COVID-19, right? And it felt like we were in two different countries. Some people were walking in the streets demanding that people just acknowledge that our lives matter. And other folks were trying to figure out how to reattribute curve space for sidewalk dining, right? Where can I get my boozy brunch? And for a lot of us, it was interesting to see that because it wasn't like 2020 was the beginning of these racial injustices. I already told you what was on our mind during Vision Zero, right? There have been countless news stories about the way that transportation is this place where folks of color are hunted, right? And the reality is transportation has always been part of our transportation, and racial justice have always been intertwined. But racism, when I say, can Vision Zero work in a racist society? It's because racism is built into every aspect of our society, whether or not you're talking about incarceration, our environmental justice and housing, or education, or an example we all like to think of in the planning space, redlining, right? And so in the summer of 2020, racism was happening, and we saw racism overlap with this pandemic because we saw that folks of color were disproportionately dying at a higher rate. And so throughout all this backdrop, Slow Streets was also becoming super, super popular, right? People didn't understand the disconnect. Sure, like 2020 exposed new like racial justice tensions and injustices for some people, but those things were always festering. Our country was built on a foundation of anti-Blackness, racism, right, and exclusion. And when we don't think about that, when we do planning work, we end up with people who think if you question enforcement and Vision Zero, that you don't care about transportation, or who come up with policies like Slow Streets, right? This is a good example of a disconnect manifesting and implementation when folks aren't necessarily thinking about how everyone might experience space, right? The intentions of Slow Streets or Safe Streets, depending on where they were, was great, right? Reduce or prohibit vehicle traffic on residential streets and really repurpose underused public space and really help make people safe at a time when they needed to get out. But we engage in planning practices often that center whiteness. And many times when we do that, we think we're planning in a way that includes the basic perspectives and experiences, when in reality, we're just planning on experiences of place and space that are afforded to those who are able to experience those places and spaces in white bodies or able bodies, right? We want to talk about reallocating sidewalk space for sidewalk dining, but what about folks with disability who all of a sudden can't get through the sidewalk, right? What about unhoused folks who are regularly told that they can't have an encampment on the sidewalk because that's not okay, but all of a sudden restaurants are popping up with big tents and that's okay, right? And so we have to understand that for some of us, you see planning and you see infrastructure, and we see a man gasping for his last breath with a knee on his throat, knowing that the green bike lane in the background didn't necessarily fix anything. We know that you can just be walking through a neighborhood with Skittles in your pocket or going on a jog, and there are people who think you don't belong there, and you could lose your life. You could be stopped for a bike infraction and lose your life. But again, when we try to talk about these things, often in planning spaces, people look at us like, why are we talking about this? And I don't want to say there hasn't been any change, right? So what happened last summer? Well, organizations started responding, right? People put out statements. We started seeing infrastructure or paint, right? Was it infrastructure or was it just like, we started seeing people want to show, at least in the public spectrum, like how much they cared about Black lives. Look, it was good for business, right? As I've said, I've ended up on the cover of Bicycling magazine, and I got to guest edit a whole issue where we just centered Black voices and we centered Black stories. Beyond that, a lot of organizations started talking about reimagining policing, right? And really thinking about ways that we can reduce police involvement in some of the things we care about in transportation, right? And so we know these conversations started. Here in LA Metro created a public safety advisory committee to kind of rethink about the way that the policing contracts looked, we saw at the national level that all of a sudden we had a transportation secretary who was willing to say that racism was built into our built environment. We had an executive order that said that we had to advance racial equity and support for underserved communities in our government work. That meant that we were going to start tying dollars to these things. And so a lot of people can look back at the last few years during this pandemic and say it really helped. But the question is, did it? Because my real question is this just a white space? When you think about urban planning, is it a white space? And I would say yes, right? When you look at the race and ethnicity of folks who are urban and regional planners, right? White folks are disproportionately represented. That means there are more white people in urban and regional planning than there would be in the general population. And it's not just that, right? We know that the people who ride transit are often diverse, low-income folks of color. And we know that transit agencies are important. They're major employers in any regions that they're in. But the reality is the demographics of transit agency employees don't often match riders. And when you look at leadership, it's even worse, right? The folks who are on transit agency boards, the folks who are CEOs and running transit agencies, they don't necessarily reflect the ridership. And when I think about, is transportation a white space, I don't just think about transit, right? Like I said, I do a ton of emerging mobility work. So when I think about Uber being super pumped, right? When I'm watching this Showtime series and reading the books and listening to podcasts, I think about the fact that when you think about who makes up the industry, just like the demographic showed us, most of the folks are white, most of the folks are men. That's replicated in our tech/transportation companies. You could argue if they're really transportation companies, but we see the same demographics, and we also see it get worse when you get to leadership. And we often, Uber is a popular punching bag, but Lyft, when they released their data a few years ago, they had the same problem, right? That biggest circle is still white. And when you get to leadership, it's more of the same. But again, when I think of the white space, I think of all of the industry. And so let's take the academic sphere, right? Who's training the next generation of our urban planners? As I said, I go to UCLA Urban Planning. I love UCLA Urban Planning. I think that it is one of the best grad programs thinking about how we talk about racial justice, right? But these are all screenshots from the website when I was applying to my PhD a few years ago. Right out front, they talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. They have folks of color. They talk about their commitment to social justice and how they're going to think about the disparities in the field. They make sure like, look, we have a ton of women and we are diversifying, right? But then you go to staff and you start looking at the faculty, and you don't just look at the faculty, but you look at who's actually a full professor, who's an associate professor, who's a partial professor, right? And what you see is there are still a ton of white men. Now, again, the department has definitely changed. Just in the time since I applied and now, we have 2 more black women who are doing transportation, but I would still argue that when you have a white space like this, you still see, even after the summer where all these organizations made statements, we're still seeing headlines like this, right? We're still seeing in places that Black and brown people who are using transportation are being targeted. And so we can't just say, well, things got better. What I want to encourage you all to do, and why I love talking to students, is because I do think the future of planning is bright. And when you think about how you can engage in this work, I think that sometimes what happens is when it's time to do racial justice or equity work, we all want to be safe. We want a safe space, right? That's what people say. They want safety. They want a safe place. But what they're not saying is that they're scared, right? They're often scared to do this work. And because they're scared to do this work gets left to the folks most impacted. Well, I'm scared to talk about disabilities. And so I'm going to leave it to the person with a disability, but I'm not going to acknowledge that we don't actually have anyone with disability. I'm scared to talk about what it must be like to be trans and use public transit because I'm not trans. So we'll leave it to the trans folks. We don't have any trans folks, right? And I think in particular, when it comes to race, what are people scared of? They're scared of saying the wrong thing. They're scared of being called a racist. And why? Because of course they're not a racist, right? How many times do we hear people list all their credentials and list all the reason why the thing they said couldn't have possibly been racist, ableist, homophobic, anti-Asian, right? Because look at my credentials. But the reality is we have to get out of wanting a safe space. We have to have a little courage, right? I get it. Why? You might not want to say the wrong thing, but you have to have courage. You gotta be brave, right? And what I always say to people is the reality is that there are many people in society who never have the option to be safe, to be their true selves. They have to be brave because every day when they leave the house, they know they are at risk to not come back, right? Whether or not that's because they're queer, whether or not that's because they're Black, whether or not because they're undocumented, whatever it may be. Those folks don't get to ask for a safe space. If you think being a genderqueer Black woman in urban planning transportation is safe, it's not. So to do this work, I have to be brave, right? And when you're brave, you're going to put yourself in situations where you will mess up. That happens. And you know what? I'm not going to lie to you. When you mess up, it's going to feel really bad. You're going to feel horrible about it. But the fact that you are going to get it wrong and you are going to feel horrible can't prevent you from trying to do the work. You got to be able to take that leap to be brave, and you got to shake it off when you do something that someone else calls you out on. You got to reflect on what you did wrong. You have to realize that for many of us who do this work and who do this work as people who hold identities and historically and still oppressed groups, when we're saying something, it's an act of love. It's exhausting because we know we can be ostracized. We know we can be blamed. We know we can be pushed out of an organization or a program, right? And so when we speak up, we're risking something. And so instead of getting defensive, reflect on what you've done wrong. Figure out a way to muster up the courage to atone for what you've done, to say sorry, and then just figure out how to do the work, right? Don't make this only our work. This is work for all of us if the future of planning is as bright as we all hope it will be. And the last thing I'll leave you with is a quote I always include in my talks from Audre Lorde, one of my heroes. I think too often we like to show up and say, I'm just here as the housing plan. I'm just here as the transportation plan. Oh, I only talk about issues related to X, right? But for the people we want to serve, for the people most impacted by all of the work we do, because planning is intrinsically tied to so many other social justice issues. Planning has been a key player, a starring role in the oppression and segregation and exclusion we still see today, right? And so if we don't start realizing that part of our work is to dismantle that, then all we're going to do is perpetuate it. And so when we show up and say, I'm only here to talk about parks, we have to realize that the people who we're serving feel like their whole neighborhood is killing them, like all the issues are connected. And so we have to start doing this planning work with the realization that there's no single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. And with that, I will wrap it up. As I promised, I wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A. And so I will do that now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika. Those were great words. It's a great presentation. Really appreciate everything you said. So now, yeah, we can open it up to questions and answers. If anybody wants to put anything in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can allow you to speak. Just fire away, please. I think we also have some of the prepared questions we can. Okay, Mary. Oh, let's see.
Hi, Tamika. Thank you so much. That was totally awesome. As a student who is working on their master's thesis on issues of mobility justice and mobility equity, where and also looking at, you know, jobs and what's next after graduation, where do you see this work being done well? Is there anywhere that's doing this work well?
Maybe that's a better question. Is there anywhere that's doing it well? So I think a couple of things that I try to think about and give people advice about. First, you have to know who you are as a person, right? And what I mean by that is, for some people, government is the perfect spot. I would not be good at government work, and maybe one day in the future I would, but like, I pop off too much, right? I remember I got a fellowship when I graduated law school, and in the fellowship interview, the committee asked everyone who's applying all across the country, do you want to run for office? And I said, not me, because I like being able to say, this is my issue. And if I'm an elected official, I got to have all the issues. And I like to be saying, no, I want to work on the intersections of this and this, right? Again, there's no single issue, but like, if I want to be able to advocate for the folks who I want to advocate for, right? And that's just me. Now, I have another friend who is one of the most skilled public folks I've ever seen, who has been working for the Department of Public Health. And something she told me once is, you know, government work is hard because the progress is slow. But when you make a change, it is long lasting. Part of the beauty of bureaucracy is that if we can change procurement so that we can pay community-based organizations, it's probably going to be a really long time, if ever, when that procurement rule gets changed. It's not as sexy, but it'll work, right? I was just talking to a friend in the PhD program yesterday who was like, I'll tell you one thing, I know I'm not an organizer. Like, that's not for me. That's why I'm in academia. And so I think one of the most important things we can do if we want to do mobility justice work is know who we are as a person and realize that we need all of those people. We need folks in government. We need elected officials. We need academics. We need community advocates. So the first thing is learn who you are and try to find a job in that space. I do think we are particularly lucky to be in California because I think I'm not originally from California, so I don't have the same California exceptionalism that many people do. But I do think that when it comes to mobility, justice, and transportation equity and justice, I think a lot of folks are looking at the work San Jose is doing around emerging mobility. I think a lot of folks look to OCDOT and the work they did about equity-centered pothole filling, the work how they did their slow streets program, got a lot of positive publicity, but then got some pushback from low-income communities of color and changed it a bit, right? I think a lot of people are looking at Salida Reynolds in LA and a lot of the equity work she's done and the women-centered work that LA Metro and LA DOT have done. So I think there are many places in California that do good work. The last thing I'll say about this question is, I also think people often favor going to work for bigger cities. And as somebody who's originally from Omaha, Nebraska, the other thing I'll say is whether you're in California or somewhere else, don't underestimate the power of smaller cities, right? Sometimes the work you can do there is even more transformative. There's fewer people to shut it down, and there is an ability to make real impact. And so I would argue that there are some places that are on the right track, even if there's no like golden standard quite yet. But whether or not you feel that way in that job is going to depend on who you are as a person and what you're drawn to. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, and it looks like we have another question in the chat from April. She says, what are some good examples of first steps you have seen in agencies working to address equity issues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, April. And maybe I'll start with some things I've seen that haven't been great. I think, again, as I said at the beginning, part of why planning work is so fun is because it's like, these are our people, right? Like we're all good people trying to do good work. And that's what I choose to believe, perhaps because I'm a bit of an optimist. And with that in mind, I think that what we've seen, especially in the last year or two, is everyone wants to do equity. And so one of the first steps they'll do is say, we need an equity program and we need to go out and do it externally. And the reason I think that's tough is because equity can't just be something that we do that's external facing, right? You can't say you want to do equity out in the world. And then again, if I go to your website, planning firm X, or if I look at your org chart, government agency or nonprofit, all the folks in power are still fitting those demographics I showed you from the chart, right? And I think part of what happens is like folks use diversity and inclusion interchangeably. They think because they have a lot of diverse faces around the table that they've done the job. But what they don't realize is they're not putting those folks of color, those folks with disabilities, those undocumented folks, those queer folks, right? They're not putting them in positions of power. They're not putting them in positions where they can control whether or not a project happens or doesn't happen, where they can allocate budget or not allocate budget. And to get to that place of inclusion, there has to be a shifting of power. And so organizations want to, on paper, say they're doing the work and say we want to do it externally, but they don't want to change their structures. They want to do different work with the same structures. They might even do a great job recruiting, but if they haven't done any of that internal organization work or internal personal work from the folks involved, then they're going to bring in a bunch of folks of color and they're going to be like, oh, they always leave after a few years. And so I think sometimes doing this work, some of the best steps are like finding partners, finding folks who are already doing this work and knowing when it's time to move out of the way, when it's time to subcontract, when it's time to bring in folks who have local expertise, and to realize that you can't just do the external work with also doing the internal work. You have to ask, am I the best situated to do this work? Is my organization the best situated to do this work? And if not, who should we be listening to? And then you can't stop there, because when you stop there is when you end up saying like, well, I guess I can't do anything because I'm always going to be white, so I can't do any of this equity work. And that's not the answer either. You have to know when you haven't done the work and when you need, like, you're not the best suited and other people have to do it, but that can't be your excuse to then not do that work, right? And so you also have to get in a place where you aren't just relying on the folks who check a certain box to do that work. You have to be doing the internal work while you're doing the external work. Hopefully that answers your question, April. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Do we have any other questions from any of the other attendees? I think I saw some hands up earlier. Let's see. Okay. Looks like Kimberly has a question. Yeah, I think you can just unmute and.
Hi, Tamika. I know we've actually met each other before. I don't know if you remember in DC. And I just want to say, I have heard you evolve over time. And I just want to say I joined late, but what I heard you say today is probably one of the smartest conversations around this topic that I've heard in a very long time. And I think what we miss is what people, especially as young planners in that field, we forget and sometimes are afraid to raise our voices and recognize that there is a whole community of people expecting for us to represent them at the table. But I think sometimes when we're at that table, we don't know how to represent the people in the community, right? And we don't understand that sometimes the decisions being made at the table really are harmful to people and that they're permanent decisions, right? But what I really like that you said the most is understanding yourself and understanding the right place for you to be. Because I think sometimes where the failure comes in is someone wants to be the rattle the chains, knock down the walls, I'm going to bust out the windows, and they want to do it from inside of a government construct, right? And that's just not the place to do it, right? And you've got to know the place to do it. So I think what you said around that is knowing, but understanding that there's a place for everybody, being inside of that government construct and being outside of that government construct are both very powerful roles, because if you have the role outside that is knocking down the walls, rattling the chains, and making people's voices heard, but being inside and affecting policy and making that change that will be on the books for a very long time is so important. And we forget about that and sometimes end up fighting against each other. I don't know if we would talk about that a little bit more. I think that that's something that is worth a little more conversation so that people absorb that and understand how powerful that is for us all to work together and how powerful the different roles are.
Yeah, absolutely. I do remember you, and thanks for chiming in. I think you're spot on, right? I think something that we have to stop doing is trying to determine who the sellout is, right? And I think that's something we too often do. We like my core group of like women of color who have helped me through this work. We have the small business firm owner, we have the nonprofit advocates, we have the government folks, and we know that we're all important. We know that we all can do each other's job, but we're all important. And I always tell people, when I had an office, when I went into the office, I always had a picture of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Thurgood Marshall up. Those were three of the folks I had up in my office, right? And like what folks have to remember is all of those folks were making change. And we like to think back idealistically that everyone loved Martin Luther King. Everyone didn't love Martin Luther King, right? Like he was being watched by the FBI. He was facing all of the same things that scary Malcolm X faced. Similarly, this super well-educated Black man who was literally part of the system, on the Supreme Court, he wasn't loved by everybody, despite, his pedigree and all of that. And so it's not like you can't choose a job to say, how can I get folks to accept me more? Because if you're pushing back, you're always going to face some people telling you that what you're doing is wrong. But you also can't say, Malcolm X, you're a horrible person because you're carrying a gun, right? Part of why some people listen to Martin is because there was a Malcolm. And part of why some people made change is because there was a Malcolm, because they would have never listened to Martin, right? I think that we just had our first Black woman appointed to the Supreme Court, right? And all skin folk aren't kinfolk, but I do think we have to realize that those folks who want to say that somehow by going to the best law schools and having this career where she's now on the court, she's a sellout. That's also wrong, right? That might not be for you, but we need all of these folks, because when I need something, I can pick up the phone and call one of these folks in my crew who have different jobs. And sometimes they are the person who can make the decision. Sometimes they can connect me to that person and offer that cosign, but other times they can just be a sounding board. Give me an opinion. Tell me why it won't work. I want to change this government thing. I'm a radical advocate, but I don't know how to change it. Well, let me get together with my homie who works in government and can explain to me why that won't work and can explain to me another perspective. So I think we have to stop calling each other out and realize that we're all necessary. The other thing I always tell folks, and this is particularly folks of color, particularly women of color, particularly queer women of color, right? Like the more identities you add, but if you're part of any group where you're in a space and you realize you're the other, you also can't call yourself a sellout sometimes. Like sometimes you got to be kind and gracious with yourself. Therapy is very helpful, but the other quote I always share is you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, right? So you also have to realize that sometimes something my therapist once told me is, you may change the world, but on your way to changing the world, you might not change that one person, or you might not change that one organization. It doesn't mean you can't change the world. What it does mean is you are expending energy on someone or something you cannot change when your bigger purpose is to change the world. And so I think we both have to be gracious with each other, and I think we have to be gracious with ourselves and realize that this fight for justice is long and hard. And so, yes, speak up when something is wrong, be brave, have courage, but it's also okay to sometimes say, I just don't have it today, right? And that's okay too.
Yeah. I think what I started saying to myself is that you can't save everybody. And yet you have to give yourself that excuse and remember that you can't.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kimberly. That's great.
Yeah, thanks so much for those words. Definitely. Do you have any other questions for Tamika? Looks like we got a few more minutes. And then we can move into our panel discussion. We can take a quick break, but if there's any more questions, please feel free to share or raise your hand and we can get on to the next part. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Tamika so much for joining us. It's been great to have you here today and having your perspective on the topics that you discussed. It's awesome. We really appreciate it. Next I can go into the introductions. Looks like we have most of our panel members here, and our moderator, so I can begin with introductions. Tamika, you're welcome to stay if you like, but I'll just go into the next portion of our event. But thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, folks.
Okay. So the next portion of our event is the panel discussion. We have a wonderful group of panel speakers here. I'll give an overview of who we have, and then I'll let people give introductions of themselves, and then we can go into a panel discussion. Let's see. Let me just share my screen again. Okay. So our panelists today, we have April Rye, the president and CEO of the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials, or COMTO. We have Clarissa Camben-Sagan, development director of Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition. We have Kimberly Slaughter, chief executive officer of Sistra USA. Natasha Opfel, associate transportation specialist with the City of San Jose's Department of Transportation Planning and Project Delivery Division, Ramses Madu, Division Manager of Planning, Policy, and Sustainability for the Department of Transportation in the City of San Jose, Jay Tyree, Service Planning and Scheduling Manager for the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, and our moderator today, Jesus Barajas, Assistant Professor at University of California, Davis, researching mobility and environmental justice. And I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panel members and moderators for joining us here today. I hope to have a great discussion. I guess we can start and just have everyone go around and introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about yourselves and your work. Why don't we start with April?
Good afternoon / evening, everyone. Thank you so much, SJSU, and all of you who helped to pull this together for the invitation. We really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here and be on, as a panelist with other illustrious people like Kim Slaughter, who I've been hanging out with all week. Here in Texas, everywhere, kidding. So I'm April Rye, and I currently serve as President and CEO of the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials. And in that role, I have the pleasure of stewarding this organization into the next 50 years. This organization has been around for 50 years, and the goal is to help build more leaders who can make the transportation industry more diverse. That's what we do in a nutshell. And this started 50 years ago at Howard University with 77 African Americans who were working in the transportation industry who saw a gap. They said, wow, we don't have many people to help support us to move forward. We don't see ourselves at the decision-making table. There's people making decisions about where the bus stops are who have never taken a bus. We need to change that. And that's what the organization has been doing for a long time. And the way we do that is through our chapters. We have 35 chapters across North America who have folks who are a part of every profession within transportation, whether they're on the finance side or communication side, advocacy, or our transportation planners and builders where the rubber meets the road. So we have a diverse set of professionals who make up our organization, and the goal is to help one another advance. Prior to that, I worked for an organization called WTS International, which is similar. The goal there is to create more women in leadership. And so I had the joy of doing the same work related to equity, just focused on women. So it's nice to be in this space. It's nice to have a big equity sunshine in transportation right now, where everyone's focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion right now, because it's what I love the most about my work, that I have the chance to make a bit of a difference so that the people who make the decisions can look like those they serve. Really happy to be here.
Thanks so much, April. Welcome. Next, we have Clarissa. If you'd like to give us a little more about you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Clarissa Cobbin-Sagan. I am the New Development Director at Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, and that's a role that I've just taken on in the past couple of months. We are a bicycle coalition that covers 2 counties, San Mateo County and Santa Clara County, and that is comprised of 35 cities and towns. As someone who grew up in San Francisco / Daly City, which is in San Mateo County, I am taking it to a personal level here, where I was a transit-dependent person. I started to bike when I went to grad school at UCLA because I didn't drive. I was taking buses and knew I needed to get by faster. And coming from a very car-centric culture and on the peninsula, always saw myself as the anomaly. People that look like me were not in the same spaces in terms of advocacy. So prior to joining the Bicycle Coalition, I had been in transportation justice work for over 10 years, also in affordable housing advocacy. And I just saw how where our industry is going when it comes to racial economic justice is that Black and Brown folks are moving to the suburbs where folks cannot no longer afford the city. And so my goal to join the Bike Coalition was to really think about how to create transportation options in places that right now are very car centric, and that's my family that I'm thinking about as I plan. And so as an advocate, I saw that I could say something in front of the dais, craft a nice message, tell a nice story, and move millions of dollars. I've done that in the Bay Area on transit, on highways, when it comes to bike share and scooter share. And I saw the need in the advocacy community to think about how to tap funding for the movement. And that means educating the community and building up teams of local advocates, which is what Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition is doing, really leveraging an organizing model where local residents are the people who build the relationship with city council and city staff to change their community. So I was very excited to make this move because I see all of my advocacy skills now put to use for the movement and for training that next generation of Black and Brown community advocates. And I will get into this a little bit later, but I think there's a moment right now in the bike movement that is now being led by Black and Brown folks. And there's a need for people who kind of get how to maneuver in the policy space to lend that support to the advocacy community. And I think in the bike movement, you're seeing a lot more. I mean, Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition is now predominantly people of color. Just in the last year, we had so much turnover. So I'm excited to see how we can change bike coalition advocacy.
Thanks so much, April. Next, we have Kimberly Slaughter. Oh, looks like you're on mute, Kimberly.
Yeah, it works better if I actually take myself off of mute, doesn't it? Well, hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Slaughter, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Systra USA. And Systra is a firm that provides design and engineering and architecture, construction and program management services in the fields of transportation and infrastructure and facilities to our clients across the United States. We are a company that's been serving in the rail and transportation industry throughout the US since 1985, and we're headquartered in New York City. But we also have major offices in Newark and Bloomfield, New Jersey, in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And of course, we have lots of projects in many other cities across the US. And as April stated earlier, that puts me on the road all the time and means that it almost makes her feel like I'm stalking her sometimes. So, but Systra is an international firm, and I am the CEO of one of our 13 international groups, one of our business groups, units around the world. And so we are a world leading engineering and consulting group that purely specializes in public transportation and mobility solutions. We have over almost 8,300 employees worldwide. We specialize, we're not one of the biggest firms, but we specialize in technology and in mobility for high-speed rail and in systems on communication systems and design of those systems for bus and rail. And we focus on innovation for today's transportation problems and tomorrow's problems. And so we are looking for young talent so that we can continue to be churning out the workforce that is thinking about what the problems will be in the future so that we can create those solutions today. And so we, and kind of thinking about the crossroads of things, I took this job with Systra about a little over a year ago, on February 1st of 2021. And just to kind of put a pin in how significant that is that I am the first person of color, first Black female in particular, first female even, to be the CEO of a major engineering consulting firm in the US. And I am the first female CEO of a business unit within Sistra as well. And now we have two, which is great. I have a colleague, Alana, who is now the CEO of our Australia, New Zealand operations. So we have a lot of females in our business line that are in very non-traditional roles. So I am very proud of that and very much an advocate of that, because I'm a female that started out in very non-traditional aspects of our business, and know how difficult it is to be female and a woman of color in those roles, and had to be able to walk in the door and have people say, oh, are you the new secretary? Are you the new receptionist? And it's absolutely nothing wrong with being the secretary or the receptionist. But if that's only what they expect me to be, and don't let me be anything else, that is a problem. So yeah, so I'm excited about having this conversation and making sure that whatever role you're in, you're making your voice heard.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Natasha Opfel.
Hi, everybody. My name is Natasha Opfel, and I am an Associate Transportation Specialist with the City of San Jose. I've been with the City of San Jose for 1.5 years, but before that, I had a run in advocacy and organizing. I did a lot of work in San Francisco, historically underserved communities, non-English speaking communities, communities of color, really rallying folks around different transportation issues. The majority of my background is in pedestrian advocacy, especially with older adults and people with disabilities, and fighting for accessibility issues within transportation. One thing that I did a lot of was bringing pedestrian advocacy. It's the connective tissue to every other thing that we do. There's a history of pedestrian advocacy that it's, we're really fighting for kind of like the leisure class walking folks. And we were starting to break that down a lot in San Francisco, and really working on a lot of safe routes to transit work. Again, accessibility needs work, and that is a passion place of mine. Tamika hit it right on the nose when she said finding yourself is so important. So I started in advocacy and realized you can only do so much shaking of the fence. Like, I'm seeing these giant gaps in private and public sector. How can I get in there and start working from the inside out? And I moved to the private sector, where I worked in paratransit, San Francisco paratransit, creating transportation programs that meet the needs of people with disabilities. And that was really great. And that was private sector. So I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many problems. I need to go to the public sector. So now I'm at the City of San Jose, and I'm just so excited because, so far I've just been surrounded by other individuals that really want to make change and get things happening. And it's a place that's really accepted my fiery heart and my ability to not be quiet when I see things that I think are inherently, unjust and things like that. So I'm very excited to be with you all here today and be amongst this great panel.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks for joining us. Let's see. Next, we have Ramses Madhu.
Hey, everybody. Ramses Madhu, Division Manager of Planning Policy and Sustainability in the Department of Transportation here in San Jose. Yeah, I feel really humbled to be on a panel like this. This is pretty incredible. I oversee long-range planning for the City of San Jose, 10th largest city in transportation, 10th largest city in the country. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of influence. So I take my role really, really seriously in terms of trying to make sure that what we're doing really meets the long-term vision that we're really being asked to meet. And we're very, very fortunate right now to have a council that is really telling us, go out there and do the hard work of changing processes, of changing project types, of realigning budgets to try and address the historical inequities that plague our city, just like all cities in America. We had a really big win this last week. Tamika brought it up, our emerging mobility plan. We were able to really focus a lot of the work of that plan around uncovering and the past of racial inequities within our city and how those have been constructed through time, everything through redlining, zoning practice, major transportation construction projects. One of the things that we looked at a lot was kind of the highway constructions in San Jose. A lot of that was just taking land straight out of lower income and racial communities, and bringing that information and then trying to bring that into the context of things like emerging mobility. It's a pretty interesting challenge, really, because honestly, when you go talk to a lot of people who aren't necessarily living downtown on very good income, things like electric scooter use and even bike share or aerial delivery drones, it just sounds like sham crap, honestly. Just sounds like some stuff that's out there that other people use. And what does this have to do with me, right? And the way that we as a city have to try and figure things out is, hey, these things are coming. How do we help shape these types of market moves, these types of changes in the world in such a way that we are meeting actual community needs and helping to redress those balances, those historical equities. It's a lot more to be said there, but I'll just say, in taking the responsibility for the kind of impact of the role I have, my biggest tactic really is to get the hell out of the way most of the time and let folks who are that much more informed and understand so much more to take the lead. Folks like Natasha Upfeld, she's joined our team and has just run with so many incredible things and has already started to help inform senior staff. Laura Stachinsky on our team, who led the emerging mobility plan, and so many other folks. And then I really liked what Tamika said about, get comfortable with messing up. And that's something that I know I've taken, I'm 15 years into my career. I have got a pretty comfortable position. Look, I'm a white guy. I grew up in Palo Alto. And I know who I am, and I'm getting more and more comfortable with being able to just say, I think this is right, and kind of putting it out there. And sometimes I take it on the chin, and yeah, it does hurt. But it is, I think that message was really, really good, because I do think that there's a real, I'd say, fear of messing up, saying the wrong thing, and then feeling like you're going to be excommunicated from the entire community because of it. And I think that was a really good message Tamika sent. I think it's something that I'd love to just kind of reiterate for other folks who are trying to wrestle with this, because it's pretty hard. And with that, I'll pass it off.
Thanks, Ramses. Thanks for joining us.
I want to add one more thing. City of San Jose is an incredible place to come work, and I hope you'll come work with us to help us solve these kinds of problems. We've got a lot of positions and roles that we're always looking to fill. So if you're ever interested in learning more about them, please do reach out, and we'd love to talk about what's coming up.
Awesome, thanks. Next we have Jay Tyree.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jay Tyree. I'm the Manager of Service Planning and Scheduling at the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, or VTA. We are the transit operator and the county transportation agency for the county of Santa Clara. The team that I manage, we're a team of 19 folks that we get to change people's lives every day. And that's why I got into this job. And I'm just so lucky to be able to do it. We have a scheduling team, we have a service planning team, and we have a passenger facilities team. They're so focused on the operations of our transit system and our transit network. I think, oh, by the way, I'm a class of 2010 graduate of the San Jose State University Masters of Urban Planning, and really look back on my time at San Jose State fondly. In my work, in our team, I think like Ramsey's, I recognize my privilege as well. I'm a white male, and I get to touch people's lives and improve people's lives. And I like I said, I'm so lucky, the work that we do, and this is why I fell into this job and this business, because talking face to face with people, when we talk about how we change transit service or add amenities and it changes their lives. Talking to someone at the Milpitas Transit Center who we just extended a route later at night and they can now get to a new job, or, it actually brings a tear to my eye so often when I'm talking to our riders. And so I take that responsibility really, really seriously. And so I love the work that we do. So, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about my position.
Great, thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. And next we have Jesus.
Well, thanks, Trevor, and hi, everyone. Jesus Barajas. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis with a background in urban planning. I have the privilege of moderating today's panel with such a great wealth of experience across the board, different sectors and different perspectives that you all bring to this important work. My research is focused on the intersection of transportation planning and environmental justice and mobility justice. And I'm really, the goal of my work is to provide all of you folks on the panel with the tools to be able to do your work better, to advocate for more just transportation systems and make better decisions, and to help those who are advocating for those decisions with that advocacy. So I don't want to take up a lot of air here because this is all about the panel. So Trevor, I don't know if I turn it back over to you before getting started, or if we dive right into it.
Yeah, I mean, this was just the introduction phase. Thanks everybody for joining us, and I hope we can have a great discussion. I can stop the screen share and then we can just get started. That works.
Sounds great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And you all already gave us a lot of background about where you are and the things that you kind of do, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you became interested or involved in the field of transportation. And whoever wants to start is welcome to, and this is open to the whole panel, of course.
I'm happy to start. So mine is an interesting journey, and I actually came into it by, you'll hear many professionals in the industry by accident. So I was a government pre-law major as an undergrad student at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and I'm a Longhorn. And went to UT Austin, and I was in my senior year of college, and my minor was in psychology. And my intention was going to law school, and I wanted to be a judge. My long-term goal was to be a judge. I thought the judicial system was really messed up, and too many people of color were their lives were being unjustly railroaded by the judicial system. So I thought it would be a good way for me to affect change in people's lives by being able to sit on this as a judge. And maybe Katanja took my role today, but who knows? As I took this class, I just needed one class to fulfill my minor in psychology. And I randomly took this class on social psychology. And it completely changed my life. This class studied how communities are arranged and how it affects us mentally. And the professor chose me to do a special project with 3 other students to take a community. It was public housing, and there were industrial smokestacks in the background. And he challenged us to redesign this housing with all the amenities that we would expect. And he chose us purposely as kids that he thought came from homes of choice, that had, that pretty much had backgrounds of higher income, and had not come from public housing. And and he said, look, I want you to figure out, what would you expect if you walked into an environment like this, and what would you expect to do or to have to protect your mental well-being, and to forget that those smokestacks were there, right? What would it be that you would want? What would you pay for? And it made me have a paradigm shift, and put me in someone else's role, of all the things that I took for granted every single day about transportation, my whole mobility of access to healthcare, to get to work, to get to school, to dry cleaners, to restaurants, to my friends, my family, you name it, right? And then when I came home, I also assumed that I came home to a place that was safe, and that was beautiful, and that gave me a place of respite and comfort, right? And looking out the window and seeing smokestacks didn't give me a place of respite and comfort, So you started designing it, looking at a way that you could forget that was there. And then you started thinking about, so what did I need to do to clean the air? And anyway, so I tell you all that because then that just really shook me up, quite honestly. And so naturally, I didn't go. I decided not to take my LSAT, and I went and worked as a journalist for a year at the Texas House of Representatives to kind of regroup and figure out what I was doing with my life. And I went back to my professor to see, how do people do this? Do people do this as for a living? And I applied to grad school. I took the top 5 grad schools at that time in community and regional planning, and applied to all 5. And and it just became more convenient and financially affordable for me to attend the University of Texas at Austin. It was in the top 5 at the time, and I got accepted there. And I also got an internship, which with a firm at the time was called Parsons, Brinkerhoff, Quaid, and Douglas. It's one of the predecessors to what's now called WSP. And I started that internship a month before I started grad school. And what was really hilarious about it is, working as a part-time intern, I was making the same amount per year as I was working full-time as a journalist at the House of Representatives. So I was going to do just fine financially. So, anyway, 80% of their work was in transportation. And so it kind of went from there. And I started to realize, I learned how transportation was key to changing people's lives, how mobility made a difference in people's lives. If I can't get to healthcare, that affects how my well-being, right? That affects how reliable I am as a student, that affects how reliable I am as an employee, that affects how well I can be a parent, an individual. It just, it affects my longevity as a human being on this earth even, right? Healthcare is key. It means my education level, my access to different types of education, my socialization, my access to realize that there are different types of lives and things outside of my community. So, so being able to realize that I could change people's lives through designing transportation, and reliable transportation, affordable transportation, safe transportation, right? That connected people all around their communities to different parts of their communities was really important and very empowering to me, exciting to me, and that I could be part of those conversations at a table with groups of people to affect that change was so encouraging and exciting to me. And I started out as a consultant at 22 years old, and I working for a consulting firm and working with public agencies around the US to do this. I got the chance to, right away, I started working with a city of Austin. I worked with in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. I immediately, upon graduation and I worked with small cities in Texas, got to do a lot of work with helping them write grants to secure money to do their operations. So I worked with small operations as well as large operations to understand there's a lot of people with a lot of passion too around delivering public transportation across our country. And sometimes they do it out of their own pockets in the more rural operations. And that's when I started to learn the disparities in providing public transportation that exists across our country. And that was really heartbreaking to me, and understanding that on a national level, the provision of federal funding to our providers of mobility was so important. And that's where I became passionate about advocating for the right policies, the right funding on a national level, and realizing that this was my space of where I needed to be. And so that's kind of where I decided that this is where I needed to be, and didn't want to be anywhere else. And so here I am today. I've been on a path of working in both the public agency side and the private consultant side. I've worked for quite a few of the companies that are in our industry, and have had the great fortune of being able to progress my career. And just having had the upbringing to be able to say to myself the right words that were given to me by my parents and by mentors along the way, to say to myself of, when I was not in the right space, that I did not think were either serving me well, or I felt were serving the mission of delivering mobility well, that it was time for me to move on to a different space, and sometimes that's a scary thing to do, but you have to step out on faith and realize that the universe will catch you, and you move ahead, and there are always new spaces to do the right thing in. So, and here I am today.
Well, I appreciate that story, and the fact that it started with one college class makes me happy as a professor to know that there might be some impact going forward. April, I'd love to turn to you.
I'm looking for my yes button. Kim, yes, yes to everything that you said. So many things I relate to, and I agree. My start in transportation was so non-traditional, just like Kim's, but mine, it started with kind of setting my value system, like what is important to me for my employment. And that really helped me to decide, what is for me. I grew up without much materially. And, you could have never told me that I would end up the president and CEO of anything, not 10-year-old April growing up. You could have never told me that. But the one thing that I did learn from, my parents was to set my value system. What is the most important thing to you that's going to bring you joy, and that is going to make sure you feel good and strong about what you're doing every day? And so that is what helped me come to transportation, because part of my value system was doing work that I felt made a difference in the world at large, and for a mission that I believed in. And so at the time, I was working for the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and I was doing government affairs and advocacy work around expanding access to healthcare. So my work really centered around communities of color, rural communities. How can we diversify the healthcare workforce so that the person who's treating you can do so with additional knowledge about your background and your challenges, How can we get more folks from different backgrounds into the healthcare industry and expand access to care? That was my work, felt really good about that. Part of my work was coalition building, the art of collaboration. How can you share and get people from different backgrounds to share to achieve a common goal? And that meant that I had to work with insurance companies and nonprofits and higher education institutions and lawmakers and real people and get them all to agree on how to move forward. Not easy, right? But I had an art for it somehow. That was my jam. And so I was approached by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And we were talking about the kind of the intersection between health and transportation. And I think we can all agree there's a big one. There's a big one because transportation connects people to opportunities, right? So I was offered a position leading an organization around transportation safety and how to involve young people in the solutions. Fell in love with transportation in general because once again, my value system, right? How can I make a difference in the world at large? Do I believe in the mission? Yes, yes. So took that opportunity. And long story short, here I am today, still working in the equity space in transportation. And the thing that I love the most about my work at Compto is that I get the chance to work with young people. We have an internship program called City Interns that connects young people to paid is the most important word, internship opportunities at transit agencies so they can get real world experience learning about how it all works. I get to do that, and young people keep you honest. They keep you resilient, and I love that. So that's something that I really love about the work I get to do today. And we also have scholarship programs that help, cover the cost of education for young ones. So, my journey to transportation was a little non-traditional, but setting my value system helped me get here.
Such important work and bringing the next generation up. I really love that. Natasha?
I love what April and Kimberly have shared about setting up their value system and approaching this career path non-traditionally, because I didn't even know urban planning was a thing till my late 20s. I grew up of, first generation Chicana, a giant immigrant family, really being one of the few English speaking person able to code switch, white presenting people of my family. I had to do a lot of advocating for my family, translation for my family, just seeing all this injustice being done to my family and others like them. I started off in housing advocacy. I was living in San Francisco, kind of just doing a bunch of odd jobs, but always found myself coming into organizing. And it wasn't until I met someone that was working at Streets Blog, which is a transportation blog that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. I was volunteering at the Bike Coalition because for various different reasons. And they were like, you should get into urban planning. I was like, what's that? He started explaining kind of all the powers that be in these kind of bureaucratic processes that were controlling a lot of the things that I was really upset about. And, that week I signed up for San Francisco State's urban planning master's, and through learning about land use and transportation, I just globbed on to transportation because that was kind of the link to opportunity that I saw limiting my family historically, myself historically, and kind of it ties everything together. My abuela, my nana, I'll call her nana because I can't call her anything else. She worked at Ross, kind of in the Coachella Valley, which is like near Palm Springs, if you're familiar with that. And a lot of my family is undocumented, so they weren't able to get licenses. And she would take the bus, and my grandma doesn't speak English. It's often really hot, 100+ degrees in the desert. The bus comes once an hour, and there's no GPS on it. It's a little timetable, and you have to have a really good guess to know when to start getting places. And I would, first couple of times I went with my grandma because my mom was nervous for her. And I realized the independence that this bus, even though it was a crappy bus, gave my family. And I realized that it was in the desert, a really stratified system, mostly low income people, mostly people of color, mostly people that were kind of suffering at the cost of, if this bus didn't show up, they weren't going to get to work on time. My grandma would have gotten fired if she wasn't able. So she would often leave 2 hours earlier than she was supposed to make sure to get there. And I was, all these wheels turning. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Then realizing all of the oppressive, racist systems that have caused these choices. I I was like, let me at them. So I jumped into transportation advocacy and really fighting for marginalized groups and historically underserved groups. And like I mentioned before, kind of starting in advocacy, doing some private sector work, and now in the public sector, really just learning how to decode all of these oppressive systems and kind of ivory towers that we've created to keep people away from the work that we do, to keep it confusing on purpose, and how we can, I want to be able to bring in the people that are most at risk from these impacts and these choices we're making into my work. So that's what just got me so into transportation. I'll stop there. But yeah, I didn't even know transportation planning was a thing until I was 26 years old.
Same here. Maybe I'll just go across my screen here. Jay.
Maybe no surprise, I also fell into planning from a single course at San Jose State University. I was getting my master's degree in economics because I just loved economics. I had my bachelor's in it, and I took a regional planning class, and I fell in love with it the first week, and the rest is kind of history, And my personal journey. A lot of getting into planning for me was kind of opportunistic. Like, okay, this is I love the work here. It's an opportunity to connect with the community, be closer with the community, and change people's lives. But then, I fell into transportation planning through an internship at VTA in 2008. You're in college, you got to get some experience. So I found an internship. And that changed my life, right? Because I thought I was going to be a land use planner. And when I experienced the impact of transit specifically on people's lives, and Natasha used the word freedom. That's totally what tugged at my heartstrings, because I realized, I am a privileged white male. I didn't have the experience that I had, was very different. And when my eyes were opened to folks that literally planned their day around a transit route, or how far they could get, or found an apartment in an area of town because the transit network was a certain way, or it would allow them to get to a job, or they couldn't get this, go to this, dialysis treatment or whatever, the impact on people's lives. It, like I said, it made me tear up. And so the rest is history for me. I went and did consulting on the East Coast for 5 years, and fell in love with the world of transportation on the East Coast, following Dr. Beverly Scott and learning everything, soaking up as absolutely much as I could from Dr. Scott. One of the things she told me, we plan with communities, not for communities. And that sticks in my head every time we talk about the engagement that we do, and how, that's what planning is. Planning is not a technical thing behind a desk. It is the art of engaging with your community and empowering your community to be the actual partners in changing the community for the better. So anyway, I did 5 years of consulting on the East Coast, then didn't like the winters. So I came back to California in 2015, and then recently got my current position.
Great, thanks for sharing. I see Ramses next on my screen.
Yeah, thanks. My path here was long and circuitous, but I'll tell it quickly. I did an undergrad in philosophy and graduated at the bottom of the .com bust, and there were 0 jobs. Finding a job, I ended up becoming a high school teacher at Job Corps, which is an incredible institution, though also a bit flawed. I actually worked for Kellogg Brown and Root officially when I worked there. And the students there were mostly from Oakland, and then a bunch of fresh immigrants from China and Eritrea on the other side. And I started as an ESL teacher. It was very impactful to me, just kind of really getting a bit of a better perspective growing up in Palo Alto and going to UC Santa Cruz, kind of broke that out. I went and did a master's degree in political science while I was teaching at San Francisco State, and got involved in campaigns. Actually, somebody, Sandre Swanson, if you guys remember him, state senator from Oakland for a while, and some other local, more environmentally sound folks, and realized that political work sucks. Doing cold calls and campaigning is not a fun job. And I realized that the real thing I really wanted to do was local policy, right? And I got a job, I got an internship at San Francisco City Hall in a legislative analyst office, and kind of learned at that point really what planning was, and the real issues at the local level, and was like, wow, okay, you know, I'm seeing my students over here. I'm seeing the kinds of the real policies that kind of affect people at that level, and applied to San Jose State, and started my master's degree there about 2 weeks after my thesis for my first master's degree was accepted. Hung out with Jay a little bit there. I think we crossed right while we were there. Rick Koss was one of my professors. And while I was there, you know, I was, I would say, I was actually much more motivated by environmentalism. That was my kind of core why I was doing this. Local issues, I want to try to solve this. You know, global warming, climate change, and just pollution and the loss of habitat kind of issues. And I took some classes. I think Charles is here, Charles Rivesplath, and some other transportation classes, and very quickly realized that that was going to be one of the most interesting and impactful fields that you can take on within planning, and kind of hung my hat on that. And I'll say through my education at San Jose State and beyond, through some lots of conferences and just training opportunities, really had my eyes open that much more to the issues that we're really focused on now, in terms of equity and the like. Yeah, that's my story.
Great, thanks for sharing. And then Clarissa.
Yeah, I hear elements of my story in each of you, so I'm trying to figure out what to share. I can't help but feel like I am coming full circle. So I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a working class neighborhood in San Francisco. I grew up in when I was young, we called it the ghetto, the hood. Like, it was not safe to go beyond halfway down the block. So my siblings, I have, my parents did, I have 4 children. We all shared one bike. And that was our freedom on that block, the south west side of San Francisco. And in the 90s, because of a lot of the kind of lack of resources, turmoil, what cities have done to Black and brown communities, leaving them to fend for themselves in the inner city, my family realized for us to get out, to get an education, they had to drive us across the border into Daly City. So I got driven from a very poor, under-resourced part of town, part of San Francisco, into San Mateo County, and I had to honestly pretend that I lived in my aunt's house. And there in Daly City, where my family currently lives, we moved there in high school, every kid walked to school. It was interesting that I had to pretend that I lived in my aunt's house and walk that block or two to the elementary school. But I did go through public education all the way through high school there. And I think that kind of formed a lot of my perspective in transportation planning. And I say come full circle because it has been an organic path for me. I thought my main goal was to understand racial injustice. I thought I was going to be a civil rights attorney. I went and worked for a law firm, and I didn't like what I saw at that law firm, where people were working odd hours of the day. And I just wanted to be in the community and help figure out what folks' needs were and get government to change it, get resources for people who barely had food on the table, were living paycheck to paycheck. And so, you know, fast forward, I found my way to urban planning school definitely thought I was going to do economic development and affordable housing. And I, like many of you, sat in a class and heard about the economics of pricing. And it was a Donald Shoup intro to economics transportation planning class, and got turned on to this idea of pricing as the way to change behavior. And I understood pricing from a different perspective. When you have limited income, you share. You have one car, you share it with your community. You give people rides. I remember growing up in church, and we picked up people. We were the bus to get to the service, and that was how my family and community shared resources. So coming to planning school, I mentioned previously, I didn't, one, realize I was transit dependent. I didn't have a license at the age of 27 because I rode the train, BART, and walked everywhere. I also went to Cal, so Berkeley made it very difficult to own and operate a car with all its policies, and had a free transit pass attached to my tuition. So I say that all because we are products of our environment, of our built environment, and also what we have access to. So, and Natasha, I think you've heard me say this before, my siblings all went to San Francisco State, very, transit first city. They all drove the 1.5 miles to get to San Francisco State because there was not a transit pass, because they could, because parking, I actually don't know if parking was free, but they still drove. I had a transit pass, so I never felt the need to go and get a car because I was just on the bus, and that formed me into adulthood. So I like that I work for a bike coalition now, because we're really trying to encourage those behaviors from a very young age. It's kind of humbling for me to share that original story of me sharing a bike with my siblings, because I realized how much of that the health and well-being aspect of transportation has been lost when I've been in the policy space for so long. And so now, as I come back to Daly City, come back to the peninsula that needs a lot of help, and the South Bay needs a lot of help to undo a lot of the racist planning decisions that have created the disparity, created the inequity, created the unfair outcomes, the lack of wealth creation in our communities. It's people like us that have this lived experience that need to lead and need to share. What is that like? What is it like when you can't pay for a tank of gas, but you gotta pick up your kids at daycare and go to your, your low-wage job? And because that's my family, those are the people that to this day still don't understand how to get their needs met by government. I'm very intrigued by groups that are out there really teaching folks how to plan their cities. And I mean, right now I'm at the Bike Coalition, and I do see that on the ground, the real need to teach civic engagement, because so many communities of color, monolingual communities that are scared of government sometimes don't realize there's actually a path there. And generation and generation, or cohort after cohort of planning school professionals that come out, I'm so excited, because I start to see a lot of the things that I didn't have 10 years ago in planning school. Like it's just the written word. It's like what people are using to go and change their communities. So it's exciting to be here and among folks that are just ready to hit the ground running.
Well, thanks everyone for sharing your backgrounds. It's there's so much of you that you bring to the work that you do right now, and how everyone kind of started from somewhere else and found the light to the work that you're doing.
Hey, Sus, can I add something there? I really loved hearing this story, because I've been in the industry for, I hate to say this because I try to tell people I'm 29, but no one believes me anymore. My oldest child is almost 25, and she keeps telling people that. So that's what makes it really unbelievable. But, when Clarissa just told her story, it is, I think back and watch, it's so important to have a diversity of people at the table, planning and being part of these kind of decisions and being part of the conversation about designing mobility and what should go into it and what it should look like. Because I will tell you, in the evolution of making these decisions, we used to use the data, and one of the key parts of the decision making of designing routes, particularly for identifying people who were really dependent, really needed transit, was you looked at zero car households from the census data, right? And traditionally, one of the things that would happen is you would look at those zero car households and then you try to figure out why a route that was designed to serve those zero car households was not successful. Well, sometimes it was because the headway wasn't frequent enough, right? But the mentality was, well, those people have no other choice. And so all we could afford to do was give them a bus that came every hour or every 45 minutes. So if they have no other way to get there, why didn't they get on their bus? But if you don't have people from those communities informing the process, right? You don't learn the stories that Clarissa just told, right? That said, because we work together, we find one person that has one car and we share it, or we find ways to work together and take care of each other to get where we need to go. You know, that's the mentality of the frame of reference that's not at the table. That's why it's so important to help people understand that there's careers out there in this community where we need different people at that table helping inform this decision and bringing that experience to the table. That is, I just want to say that I was really loving hearing everything you guys said. And I'm old enough was sitting here to go through history going, man, I can think of times when, you know, when that kind of thing, remembering conversations and how listening to what you guys just talked about, how it makes a difference and how things are decided and made differently now, right? So thank you for being at the table. That's all I just wanted to say.
Well said, thanks. So we'll turn to the next question, and thanks to the student organizers for helping to put these questions together. What are some of the most pressing issues that communities of color face when it comes to transportation planning? And I think focusing specifically on how you see it in the work that you do is the way to address this question. And so maybe, Clarissa, we ended with you. Maybe you're a good person to start with this question.
Sure. I'd say this is not rocket science, but communities that are so overburdened by so many other oppressing issues, right? Transportation is honestly one of those things that like people kind of that go under the surface, like people just assume it is the way that it is, right? Even if it's usually the second most expensive thing that you're paying for. So it's almost considered the thing that you can't change. It's a given. So for our communities, I feel that, you know, you're more concerned about, can I pay for my housing? Can I get to the job that's going to help me pay for my housing? Here in the Bay Area, I think that's the biggest concern most folks have, just because it's so expensive. You saw during the pandemic when people lost their jobs, our unhoused populations across the board. You know, it's heart-wrenching, but because of that reality, I don't think people can come to the table and say, I want this to change about my situation. I think they're saying, give me a job that pays me well. Let me find some housing that is adequate and not dilapidated. Like, that's the reality of a lot of working class people in the Bay Area. You see people living in their cars, in mobile homes, in garages, like people creating housing out of substandard conditions. And it doesn't have to be like that, right? And I know I'm talking about that housing piece, but that sometimes is at the forefront of people's minds. I recently helped with a process in Oakland that was about zero emission vehicles and getting those in the hands of disadvantaged community members. And we were charged with trying to go into disadvantaged communities and talk about electric vehicles. And they're like, I need a job. Let's talk about jobs. If this conversation can give me a job, I'll come to the meeting. And other things like, you know, feeding people in that space and making sure there's childcare. So there's a lot of ways that we can change, I guess, how we as planners come into communities by first listening. And I think there's so much of public policy that says it needs to change this way. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and thus do X policies. It's e-bikes. So let's find people, give them e-bikes and they'll bike. And that's not necessarily the case. If you give someone an e-bike, they'll actually get on the bike. You have to really understand the totality of someone's needs, transportation needs. So I think fundamentally, people don't really think about their transportation needs unless it really hurts them where they need that solution. And I would honestly say that the job and the housing is top of mind. And if you could equate the top priorities for our communities to transportation, then that's an in. But I've learned to not lead with transportation. Something we did during the pandemic at the Bike Coalition was to work with Veggielution and provide food boxes to families in need during the pandemic. So that's one way we've shifted to think about the things folks need, the food, and use bikes as a means to get folks food. And I think our industry is changing to understand that reality, because so many meetings that we've tried to set up and expect people to come or to care about what we're talking about don't really pan out. So I'll leave the rest of you all to share your ideas. That's what I've run into a lot.
I can run from there because I think a lot of the themes that you brought up really fit within the work we're doing in San Jose. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is actually recentering the work around people's actual experiences. And I think what you just said, Clarissa, is really, really right on. It's like, you know, on one hand, especially when you're, you know, my job is to see scale and say we have a 180 square mile city with 1 million people, and we have these really big goals. We need to meet greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Like, that's a real moral calling and a very, very serious one, right? And so it's so much easier to say, our program is, and I love the electric bike one because it seems so innocuous, but it's right. Here's a whole bunch of electric bikes. Let's just throw them in your neighborhood. And, you know, and then people are like, well, okay, that kind of feels like you're gentrifying my neighborhood. They didn't talk to me about this. Is this for me? Is this something that is in any way designed around my life? And it might be, right? But no one talked to me. So it just feels like it's just being done to people. And to a large degree, it's right? And so how do we improve that, right? It really is about actually going out there and saying, I don't know. What is it you need, right? What is it that really is going to help your life from your perspective? And how do we have a conversation with what you bring up and with what these other goals are within the city, and having that conversation, right? And actually saying, look, we do need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's not going to go away. Like, that, no matter how much you talk, like, that's something we need to address. And the BIPOC communities, like, how do we make sure those interests are actually brought to the table and really being listened to and centered? And centered doesn't mean being the only one, right? It just means actually having conversations that say your lives are constructed because of history in different ways. What's your individual and group experience, and how do we bring that into the processes? So I just really thought the thread you were building there is really good, because it really is and it's very hard, honestly, working from the governmental perspective. It's not super simple, right? Because we're tasked with things like, here's a grant application for work that we will get done. Maybe I wrote the grant, so maybe I'll do it. By the time the grant comes in, I might have left or promoted, or someone else might be in the position. Someone else has to now take that and run with it and implement it. Natasha's experiencing that with a couple of things in our group, right? And the scope of that may or may not have been worked out with the public. It may or may not have been, by the time it gets put out there, done with the public who's still there, right? And so there's a ton of just like, how do you even line up what the work is with the community and interests, right, in a consistent way? And I think there's ways to work towards that. And I think but that continuation of how do you actually keep an active conversation going? We're not funded to do that in the public sector. There is not money to just interact, to just keep the conversations going. And we keep trying to set up process to do that. We have one that's kind of successfully going on the East San Jose area. We have a plan called a Movimento there. We're trying to keep the conversation centered in the community, and we have to go back. And it's really hard because people are like, you guys are the government, you keep effing up, we're going to blame you for everything. And they kind of should. Right? People should. We are, though, that is the power we have, right? And so just kind of trying to drive that thing home of just actually having the voice and perspective present and continuously present, so that we are continuously making decisions about programs, infrastructure choices, and the like in a way that actually reflects those versus what I got taught in school or what we think is the right thing. Which usually is informed by prior conversations, right? So anyways, I'll stop there.
Natasha?
Yeah, I wanted, in the question of like what issues are affecting our communities of color and our marginalized communities, one thing that I see a lot in the Latino community is that we are not a monolith, but government often treats us to go and talk to that community. And that community is, especially in San Jose, across the United States, very, very diverse. So when, Natasha, Latina, you can speak Spanish, please go talk to the Latino community and tell me what they think. I'm like, oh man, you're setting me up for failure, because we need to think about the intersectionality of different oppressive factors that Latino community has been dealing with a lot of crap for a long time. And there's a lot of Latinos that are now 4th, 5th generation established homeowners that have worked for that American dream, have been pushed into car ownership, rode the bus their whole childhood, and every day on that bus it's like, I can't wait to have a car. I can't wait till I can have my music playing, my air conditioning playing. In my neighborhood, majority Latino, there are multi-generational households where the older children, 25 to 28, still live with their parents. They don't feel like they're ever going to be able to afford a house in the Bay Area, but they have a car, and that car gives them a place to, when they get home from work, they hang out in the car for a while, 2-3 hours sometimes, just to have a private place to call their own. And when I'm tasked, because I do believe in these moral obligations to lower greenhouse gas emissions, to lower single occupancy vehicle trips, and I go in and I'm saying, hey, you should be car free. They're like, whoa, 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 you're telling me this now? You're telling me to assimilate to American culture, which is all around the car. You're telling me that I need to, present and say that I've made it, which having a car is part of that. There's a lot to unpack there. And many of those people are so concerned with the things like, Clarissa's been saying, just trying to get by. They're not often thinking about our transit dependent populations within those same demographics. And what I'm really trying to do with my job is kind of dig into like, who are we really wanting to speak to and who are we advocating for? Because even though in government you're not supposed to advocate, we are campaigning a lot of the time. And things like Vision Zero and things like transportation planning in general, I'm looking at communities of color, underserved communities, low-income communities, and then within that, our transit-dependent communities, our communities that have to walk, our communities of people with disabilities that need special, attention, and how to tell that whole story in one public meeting where I'm told go listen to the community is such, just a humongous task, and we're not formulated in government and in a lot of ways to have these really in-depth conversations. And I'll stop there, and I'm sorry if I wasn't so articulate, but there's just so much going on. And when we tackle these like equity initiatives by saying, go talk to this one community, but we're not giving ourselves the time to really truly understand exactly what communities are within that, and all the different factors that are going into why they're making the choices they are, we're really setting ourselves up for failure and those communities up for failure.
April.
I agree with everything that's been said. And Natasha, you were very articulate. That was excellent. We got you. I appreciate what Clarissa said too in the beginning. You said it's not rocket science. Clarissa, totally agree. The problems are so basic. Transportation should be the great connector, period. It should connect people to opportunities, education, employment, life. It should. But that connection requires access, and the access isn't equitable. That's the problem. And, you know, experiences of different members of each community affect their approach to systems, like Natasha was bringing out. You know, I think back to growing up, safety is a big factor. And I know, like, women, you know, our trips commuting are longer and more expensive due to safety concerns. We know that, and other factors. But part of the overall challenge is that the people making the decisions often don't reflect the users of the systems. That's a big factor. We have to acknowledge that. And it's everything from frequency of, you know, availability of systems to fair enforcement. You know, we need people who have had diverse experiences to make decisions. And so, you know, in my role at Compto, I realize that we have a need, we have a gap to fill. We have to attract young people to this industry and keep them here, and then position them for leadership roles with intention from day one. From planning, we have to prepare them as new professionals for leadership roles, for roles on boards from their first day in transportation, because then they can bring all those experiences to the table, the experiences of their parents and grandparents and others, and they can help us to make different choices that will hopefully change the system for the better for everyone.
Yes, April, access to me really strikes a nerve, because I think a lot of this, we, the practitioners in this field of transportation planning, we do it to the field, and it's a disservice to our community. What we do, we put up these, like someone said, ivory towers, right? This is a white space, and worse, it's a space that you have to be able to see. You have to be able to speak English. You have to work a 9-to-5 job to come to the community meeting after hours, right? You have to be comfortable enough to comment in public setting in front of others. There's so many barriers that we put up that I think one of the challenges for minority communities, non-white communities, are access to us. We have the power, right? We have that power. And so they don't have access to us. And that's by design. And I can't stand that. And it frustrates me so much about that model of engaging the community and not. And so when Tamika was talking about shifting that balance of power, I really see that. I see that in the work that we've done. The times where it's been most successful is when we've empowered the community and maybe given them more power than we were even comfortable with going into. But who are we to say, right? So I completely agree. It's such a white space and worse. And so I think that we do it to ourselves.
Yeah, we talk about this term of universal accessibility in terms of trying to make our systems more universally accessible by various, by everyone, right? But I think we need to broaden really that definition and meaning that we are actually going out to the people to make our systems universally accessible in our means of communication, because we don't put communication in that definition of universal accessibility, right? In two-way communication, and actually in making sure that it's incorporated and reflected back in everything that we're doing. I think about when I was 17 years old and I got my first internship before I was going to college. I thought that my mother was giving me her car to drive downtown to go, because it was with a bank. So I thought I was getting her car to drive to the bank to go to my internship. And I had a really rude awakening when that Saturday before the Monday that I was starting my internship, that she drove me to the front of our community and she stopped and she introduced me to the bus stop sign. And she said, "You see that sign, right, bus stop right there? That's where you'll be catching your transportation to get to work. And it's your responsibility to call and find out what's the schedule for that bus." She said, "And I'm doing you a favor. I'll actually drop you off at the bus stop." She said, "When I was a young mother, I actually had to walk from the house out of the community with small children to that bus stop to get to work. So consider this an upgrade." And I was like, "Oh, okay, thanks." And I knew not to complain about that, mind you. So but in that it's all about perspective, and it's getting people, it's understanding that feel of what are people having to do in order to get there, right? How I had an able body that could get on that bus, right? But what if I don't have that able body to get on that bus? What are my challenges? Sometimes the most frustrating thing as a planner, my background is in planning, as a planner or going out there to a bus stop, and you've got the pole that's sticking right at the edge, right in the middle of grass, right? If I'm physically challenged, how do I roll out? How do I roll my wheelchair out to actually get to the door of the bus across the grass? What if it's rained all day? It's this thought that doesn't get someone from the sidewalk to the actual door of the bus. Or better yet, you've got a great pad, but somebody else comes along and puts a utility pole right in the middle of it. I mean, we, as part of WTS, we had a great project where we had young group of women through Transportation youth, high school students, come with us to build a better bus stop. And I was taking them to the bus stop that I thought was the really good bus stop. Okay. And these kids all came out of South Chicago. And I took the kids out to the bus stop and asked them to critique the bus stop. And I thought they were about to tell me all these wonderful things about the bus stop. And they started tearing this bus stop apart, telling me how unsafe it was, how they thought, how dangerous it was. And I was floored because I didn't have their frame of reference. They were saying it's too close to the street. Someone can push me in moving traffic. It's about having diverse voices at the table, different frames of reference, talking to people. And if we need to purposely embrace people and bring them to the table, and we need to do it not just in the public agencies, we need to do it in the private sector. I have been really fortunate to have a career that's allowed me to play in both sides of that arena, right? And we're doing a really good job of having a lot of diversity on the public agency side. But I will still tell you that when you get to that C-suite, it doesn't look as diverse, right? But we aren't doing as good a job on the private sector side. We're trying, we're getting there, but we've got a long way to go. And certainly when it gets to the C-suite, it's not nearly as diverse. So, but we've got to, but we've got to have that interest too, right? And some of it starts through internships, and we've got to stop saying, this is one of my pet peeves, right? We've got to stop defining it as only a space for engineers. I love my engineers. Most of my workforce are engineers, but I need more than just engineers. I need engineers, I need planners, I need architects, I need marketing staff, I need economists, I need you name it. I need good writers. I need mathematicians. I need people. I need software developers. I need people. I need people of diverse capabilities, putting their minds together and thinking about how do we solve mobility. We need to try to make sure we're not defining our workforce so narrowly that we shut these younger generations out. right? And they don't see themselves in us. That's been my biggest concern, that sometimes I hear, these conversations and they don't see themselves in us. And I think that that's part of what we need to do when we're out there in those communities. We need to, it's an opportunity when we're working with communities. It's also an opportunity for us to sell ourselves, so that some of those young people that are coming with their parents to community meetings to see us and say, I want to be that when I grow up, right? Help them see themselves in us. That's the opportunity for us to get fresh workforce people, in our pipeline, right? I don't know. I'm always trying to bring the next generation in, because I know I'm now on the other side of that pipeline, and we need it's changing rapidly, and we know that we're having a hard time filling the positions that we have today. So we need to work really diligently in bringing those voices to the table. And if they're thinking about it, if we catch them while they're at that environment, right? You think about it how you treat people when they're at those public meetings, and people bring their kids with them, right? They bring their kids with them. If you make that impression on that child while you're there, they can see themselves in you, and hopefully decide they want to be you when they grow up.
I want to be when I grow up, Kim. I want to be when I grow up.
No, you don't.
So I think both April and Kimberly, Kim or Kimberly, I'm sorry. Okay.
Either.
Okay, great. So I think both of you brought up a couple answers in advance already about how we can begin to address the inequities created by some of these unjust planning processes. And that's bringing up young people, young people who are diverse in background and their lived experience, diverse in education. But maybe I'll kind of turn specifically to the public sector folks, and how within the public sector we can work to address inequities created by some of these unjust planning processes. Yeah, Ramses.
It's really, really hard. I'll just start with that. It is. They are embedded, and they're embedded at all different layers, right? They're embedded at the rules that are made, literally the physical infrastructure and setup of things, and the perspectives, right? Both in elected folks and leadership. So what can we do? What I've been seeing happening in San Jose has been pretty heartening in this. We are getting folks from many aspects of the administration, many aspects of the overall political process, pushing us to go in the right direction. I won't say they always show up. Some of them come back at us when we try, and we're probably messing up too. But it does take the organization to change. This is a large issue thing, right? It's again because it's embedded in all those different things. So I think the ways that we can do it are one, making sure leadership prioritizes the values of it, and that can be really hard, right? Because as everyone's been pointing out, the C-suite, well, the public C-suite doesn't look all that different, honestly, than the private C-suite. And in places like San Jose, like sure that the council might look a little different, but then you actually go to the administration, and I'm sorry, but almost all of the city manager's office is white. But okay, getting off that, the folks in those places, the directors, really saying, hey, we want to value this. And what we're seeing in San Jose, again, it's heartening, because what we're seeing is folks being like, oh, I know I have to do this. God, I'm so scared of it. But they're still trying. And there's, we now have budgetary processes where we have to write up how our budget is a statement of equity, how it actually meets in that. Now, half that writing is, oh my God, I have to say something about this, right? I mean, it's perfunctory. But you know what? The fact that we have to do it is starting to make everybody think about it. Right. And so you're starting to get that institutional language start to spread out, and folks from the top down having to think about it. Then at our level, where we're really running the work and monitor and engaging public, and that is being a little bold, being a little bit courageous, and saying, cool, leadership, you said we should do this, so we're really doing it, right? And really kind of put your neck out a little bit, and try and do the harder outreach, which means actually bringing in the historical elements, leading with race, right? Really actually saying, we know we're racist. We as an institution, we as a society, we are racist. How do we get to that, right? And so that the perspective matters. And then process-wise, it really is, equity versus equality. Actually making sure that when you write your grant scopes for your planning exercises, you write in those extra pieces that say we need to do outreach within our BIPOC communities at a higher level than others, right? And whatever right expression of that is, and you put in, that scale that we're all kind of looking at now, right? Is decision, the empowerment scale, right? Is kind of government decides what to do all the way back to the community making decisions. Kind of, there are projects that fit in different places of those scales for good reason. Really make sure that you're looking at that scale and thinking about where the right piece is, and bringing folks in. There's a lot more to be said there, but we only have so much time, so I'll leave the floor to others to fill in more.
Full perspective, Ramses is my boss, or transparency. So I agree with everything you said, and that's something that we're doing very much on the ground. But one thing from my background of being an advocate and then also working in the private sector is I think the public sector is only as good as all the different inputs coming in. And we need to be playing inside baseball at all times to really be moving stuff forward. My favorite thing is when I know something's up for budget, up for talking to senior staff, I can whisper to the Clarissas over at the Bike Coalition and be like, hey, we really need you to show up to this meeting so that you can ask for this pot of money that you might know is available. From the private sector side, knowing that when a city is putting out an RFP for a grant, you can write in like, hey, these are all the extra things I can bring. I can bring my equity team. I can bring this unique form of data analysis because I have the money leverage expertise to Kimberly's team. You have a whole marketing team behind you that the city might not have. So really knowing how to pull all those levers and get the right people in the room at all steps of the way. I mean, the disability community has this in the bag, and often they push the public sector by lawsuits, and that's how they get stuff going. And I think that there is room to be more transparent with government as to when these participatory when things are happening early enough. All too often with our outreach, it's when we've already made 70% of the plan and we need to figure out the last bit. But if we can really bring all people in from, other professional sectors and then the public early enough in, that we can get more of a hive mind together and start, conspiring and scheming early enough to really move that needle forward. Because we can't do it when, I think Tamika was saying, like, when we're all just calling each other out or saying like, oh, you're a sellout, or oh, you're too, you're not grassroots enough. I feel that a lot. I feel coming from organizing that I might be a sellout, or am I getting too complicit am I complicit in this injustice? And I think that there's room to push against that. I have tension with that myself, but if I'm, doing my best to move the needle internally and sharing that outwards, I think I'm doing a pretty good job. It's hard for me to say that, but yeah, anywho.
I think on the public sector side, the discussions we make a lot of decisions, and we can impact people's lives every day. And yes, the pace of change is slow, but we make a lot of decisions. And the discussions that you have influence the decisions that you make. And so I look at it, we have a huge opportunity to recognize that the inequities in the system that are out there, for example, in the transit service planning business, and particularly in Santa Clara Valley, we have these long-standing racist policies and orientation towards basically getting rich tech bros to work, right? And so recognizing, okay, there's an inequity in our system. We're putting so much focus on one market because they're the loudest voice, right? They're the ones that have the ear. They're the ones that have the access. They're the ones that are able-bodied and they're white and they're part of that system. Recognizing that is number one. But then number two, going out and centering the marginalized communities and actually listening, right? I think a big part of this is just listening, because if you're having the conversations with the right communities and your conversations change from getting to my tech job to issues of policing on transit, issues of how often the bus comes, issues of safety at a bus stop, issues that women face riding transit. There's the conversation changes. And so then it gives you a better perspective of the issues that the community is facing, and you can make better decisions. And so I think that's been really effective for us in changing the way that we kind of come out from behind our desks and we are able to make better decisions through different conversations that the community actually cares about. And they're kind of based from the community, come from the community.
Larissa, I wondered if you had a thought as sort of the advocate that often bridges to the public sector to get to push them to address inequities in the work that they do.
One of the key things, I think someone already said this, where was it Ramsey? He said that there's not funding for the engagement, right? The sustained engagement of communities. I feel that has been the biggest change that I've seen local government move towards, is actually writing in community-based organizations into RFP processes and funding folks to participate. They're just one of the kind of commonsensical things to do. Like you want to talk to folks who would rather go and make some money to feed their families. Like this is one way to do it, which is make sure that people are resourced to be at the table, and also creative ways to sustain that engagement. As an advocate, I am, and for the Bike Coalition, I'm the development director. So I'm talking to lots of tech companies for sponsorships and also foundations alongside our city. So as that person who kind of navigates many different industries, connecting the dots for government is helpful, because sometimes it's not within government funding that you can get that done, but it's a foundation that cares about public health or some other entity that might not be the city. So I think cities get that you got to pay for people's engagement, and it's also it should not be the afterthought like it has been for decades, and it should not be the check the box kind of thing. And you're starting to see some innovative ways that cities are doing this kind of engagement. So I would say that that's one of the things that I would charge cities to do, is think about your limitations and how do you still sustain that engagement given those limitations. Because when you see, and I'm speaking from my past experience here in Oakland, maybe one plan we had $5,000 for the community. 5 years later, we're actually giving the community $50,000 at a time to sustain that engagement. And as long as folks are building that trust along the way, and starting to see their people in local government in places of power and compassion over the decisions that they're making, I think we can go far there. So do not discount the need for community resources in order to get that. And also a lot of it is trust building. And it's unfortunate that we do see lots of turnover, especially from Black and Brown folks who don't feel like the whiteness of government is for them. And I've honestly seen a lot of people leave I would say prematurely, because it's too hard on folks psyches to be in that space. So restructuring how government can bring in the people that are needed. And some of that is leadership. And I don't have an answer there. I do feel like there's a key thing about job training, internships, some way that we can restructure how we bring in Black and Brown folks into places of power within local government beyond the elected space as well.
Yeah, April.
I just wanted to piggyback off of what Jay and Clarissa said, because it sparked something in my brain. Jay, you were talking about listening, how important that is. I mean, literally 2 ears, 1 mouth. Why do we have that? Let's think about that. And Clarissa, what you're saying about incentivizing the feedback, I just participated in this huge call with the federal DOT with regard to how they can structure programs to be more equitable. And one of the things that I said was, you know, community engagement, it requires feedback, right? But can we incentivize the feedback? Because we have to be honest, marginalized communities have been burned. You know, they've either been overlooked or they participated in the process and then their feedback was not acknowledged. And so it's just really important that we find a way to appreciate and incentivize folks to be a part of the process over the long term. And even just simple things like breaking down the ask in a tangible way. No acronyms, no acronyms. Break it down. What are you looking for? What information do you need? We live in this space, so we know what all these alphabet soup is, but these real people who are utilizing our systems, they don't know what that is. So we have to break it down in a language that we can understand and in terms we understand, so we can get the feedback that we're seeking. And we have to offer multiple options on how to obtain that feedback. The pandemic taught us so much. If you think about how we had to get the word out about what vaccines were available, what information was real and good, and with regard to health concerns, I mean, I saw all types of things being employed. I saw radio programs. I saw knocking door to door. I saw, you know, things online, phone calls for the elderly people who aren't good with, you know, the internets. So we just have to be thoughtful about how we ask for feedback, offering different options, and then hopefully we can incentivize folks to support this, and then we can get their buy-in and they can feel like they were a part of that planning process.
I think the simple truth, though, is, April, where you hit in that, is that just many times we just don't follow up to show people how we did incorporate their voice, right? What was the outcome of them being a part of the process? Shameless plug for a book that is coming out of Women in Engineering, and I did a chapter in there on rail, and I took the perspective of writing that chapter that some of the most successful rail projects are ones where the project manager actually was one that included community involvement, and that they went back to the community to say, look, here's where I heard you, and we changed the alignment based on your input, or we changed the way the vehicles look based on your input, or we relocated the stations, you know, based on your community input, or we didn't do this project at all, you know, because of what you said. You know, some kind of, it's a two-way conversation. You can't just go out there with public meetings and say, tell us what you want. You hear the people and then you never go back to them and let them understand how you heard them and what you did with the information. And in all honesty, that happens a lot. And so we do have to go back to the community and make it a dialogue, make it a partnership, and go to them when we don't need something from them as well, right? You know, it's when we just want to hear their voices, just want to say we're still here and we appreciate you. So.
It's a great point. Yeah, Trevor, ready to chime in.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to check in. I know we've been going for about an hour and a half, and that was about the panel discussion. So I just want to see how you guys feel. We probably have maybe a half an hour left. Maybe we also continue, but if anyone in the audience have any questions, I just wanted to check in with you guys just to see.
Yeah, I'd love to take audience questions, and if we need time to queue them up, I think your last question you proposed, Trevor, about this current policy issue on the gas rebate proposal is a question that I'm interested in hearing from the panel, because I certainly have thoughts about it. But maybe if audience members want to queue up their questions, and we can kind of get to this last question about this proposal. The governor has proposed $400 payments to vehicle owners for up to 2 vehicles in the house, and free transit for 3 months, and pauses on inflationary adjustments to taxes, to the gas taxes and excise taxes in response to this increase in gas prices over the last month. You heard from New York today, the governor there is proposing a similar gas tax holiday for the rest of the year. Thinking about sort of equity and transportation, is this where we should be spending our resources in a scheme like this, with those car payments and that free transit to account for this raise in gas prices? Ramses.
I'll just say 2 things. I don't need it. I don't need that money. I don't need that help. And we should be helping those who do need it. And the blanket version of this policy is regressive and hurts the future of transportation. It's a bad policy. It's a policy that is political in nature and not solving the issue. There is a more surgical version of this policy that makes a ton of sense, right? And that's looking at means-based payment of these things, because $400 to folks who make incomes, which I'm pretty sure every single person on this panel makes enough to not really notice that over a year. But if you took it away from us and you gave the folks who it does matter to $800, or even at that point, $1,200 or more, you're making a real impact. And so I think there's a few different pieces of this that, from a transportation policy and trying to get things done wise, increased gas prices are a damn good thing for the future of the world, right? People's movement to electric vehicles and transit is what we really need. And I think that we really need to just kind of remember that part of it, and then move the funds over to the folks who actually need it. I know a lot of us got these tax refunds over the last few years for COVID reasons, and it just seems so kind of silly for some folks and really meaningful others, and it would have been so much more meaningful for the others if we could just spread the money in a more equitable way. I'll also say gas tax holidays only hurt the ability to invest in the transportation systems that will help folks get out of expensive automobiles. And so we will be seeing future less investment in our transportation system through those kinds of things. So those are my thoughts.
Any other want to chime in? I don't know. Like, my thoughts are very similar to yours, Ramses. So
one thing that I would love to get other panelists to, and even like just the general attendees is, I feel like this is a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and we definitely need to get money to the people that need it, because right now, as we've all been saying, people need a lot and really fast, and a whole spectrum of needs. And one thing that is when my mom, she talk about I don't know what transportation planning is till I'm 25. My mom still doesn't know what I do for a job. And when I start talking to her, who lives in Southern California in like a very not dense place where you need to drive everywhere, as soon as I start saying, like, push up my glasses, the actual cost of gasoline should truly be around $15+ a gallon. Her ears close up. She doesn't want to hear about it. Gas tax being regressive. She doesn't want to hear about it. How do we, again, we have to campaign these moral and, thoughts and how do we do that to, I think it's through capacity building and education, but, I don't know how to have these conversations when the pain is just so real for so many people that they just want, again, that sip of water, but they're, fully dehydrated, to use a bad metaphor. But yeah, I don't know how to get all this common knowledge that we have as academics and transportation planners around gasoline to a gas dependent group. And I think there's long-term planning solutions for that, but yeah.
I think maybe good politics, but terrible policy is how I also view this. I think there's a missed opportunity here. If it's a lot of money, and it's taxpayers' money, and it has the potential to set signals about what we value. And unfortunately, I think it's setting the signal that we want to, we're missing an opportunity to push folks to, walking, biking, taking transit, etc. Yes, there's a transit element of it, although I feel like it's just like breadcrumbs, just so it sounds like a better bill. So I'm a little disappointed, and I hoped it could be better.
To me, this is a bait and switch. This is not about good transit. This is not in a positive direction for our industry. I'm sorry. This is not one that's in our better interests. We need to be using this opportunity to look at directing people towards sustainable, long-term, positive solutions, and this is not one of those. And I just don't want to give it too much airtime.
Well, maybe we'll stop that conversation. I think, Natasha, you did bring up an interesting point, or an important point or question about, and it relates to more than just this policy, but how do we as academics, as planners, as practitioners, as advocates, communicate the benefits of kind of transitioning away from a currency of driving to more sustainable modes, when we also have to deal with the fact that the car is an essential way to get around because of the spatial structures that we have in the United States. And that's not something that I've quite figured out how to do. And it's a challenge for all of us, I think. So I think I want to make sure that we do have time to take questions from the audience. So if I'm not sure how we're doing this technically, but if audience members can unmute or put their questions in the Q&A, I'd be happy to read those off as well.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great if anyone has any questions. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate all your time, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, or if you want to just speak and raise your hand, we can call on you. Just let us know, but thanks a lot.
I'm going to have to jump off pretty soon here, but we had a great question from Anthony that I was able to type a response to, just about how can organizations like COMTO be a connector for young ones who are looking to enter this industry but have real challenges like their immigration status or balancing their commitments between work and the expense of education. And that's what COMTO and organizations like COMTO are here to do, is to provide some of that practical support and a network. Someone that I talked to recently called organizations like COMTO like a kitchen cabinet. Like your kitchen cabinet has all the essentials in it, right? You grab it, you can make up a little pasta or something, you grab your kitchen cabinet. Well, everybody needs a kitchen cabinet. Everyone needs someone they can go to. Like Kim, I can call, ask, say, hey, what would you do? I need some advice. I need to understand what to do in this weird situation. Everybody needs somebody. You need your tribe. And when you find an organization like COMTO or WTS or Latinos in Transit or any of those organizations, you find your tribe, people who care about your success and who have been there and done that and wrote the book. And so find your tribe, find your organization that can provide that support to you, that network, and then keep in touch and get involved. Because then as you go through your journey, whether you're just budding out or whether you're looking to transition to a leadership role, you have a kitchen cabinet, somebody to check in with, provide you some support and guidance, who is like-minded in this industry. Thank you all so much for inviting me. I have loved being with all of you and hearing all of your very smart things you've said. I've taken a lot of notes here.
Yeah. In April, can we tell people to remember to diversify their tribes? Don't get into personal silos. Make sure that you cross-pollinate those kitchen cabinets, so that you broaden that network.
100% agree. Where's my yes button, Kim? Yes, 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 yes. Diversify that kitchen cabinet. It can be an older person, younger person, someone who looks different than you, a couple shades darker, a couple shades lighter. Maybe they have a disability. Maybe they are from another country. You want your tribe to look different because then it'll be balanced and you get amazing perspectives.
I love the kitchen cabinet metaphor. It's
not mine. I stole it, but it's a good one, right?
That's great. It's great. I've heard the toolbox, but the kitchen cabinet, I love it. So I know there's other panelists who do have to leave, and we started this panel earlier than we were expecting to start it. So maybe this is a great time to say thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you to the student organizers for putting this on. Thanks to the sponsors for sponsoring this panel, and thanks for inviting me to moderate. It's been a great experience. It's great to meet you all, and for those I know, great to see you again. And this has been a great session.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Thanks everybody for joining. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.